On our author interview program afterwards, Messiah College history professor John Fea interviewed author Ben Howe about his latest book that asks if evangelicals are choosing political power over Christian values. Here's a portion of the interview.
What a lot of Christians do, and in a lot of elections, not with just Donald Trump, is they will look at what they think is the most urgent issue between politics and religion. And if at the moment the more urgent issue is the politics, and whatever religious considerations they had prior are still there, they're going to pick this more urgent thing because this doesn't really have to do with this until they need it to. I think Robert Jeffries, the First Baptist Church pastor, he showed a good example of how that works when he wouldn't endorse Mitt Romney in the primaries, and he spent a lot of time saying that they had to do whatever they could to stop Romney on spiritual grounds until he was the nominee, and then suddenly it was fine. That's compartmentalization.
What do you say to the, because I get asked this a lot too, what do you say to the person who says, and this is classic Robert Jeffress, he's a commentator on Fox News, right? I hear him saying this all the time. The church's responsibility is one thing, to preach the gospel and so forth, but the government's job is to kind of protect us. That's a sense of compartmentalizer, and Donald Trump is protecting us. He's protecting our borders. He's a strong man who's going to fight the Muslim threat. And so in other words, it doesn't quite matter. We know he's a sinner. We didn't hire a pastor in chief, right? How do you respond to that critique?
Well, using Jeffrey still as the example for a moment because he's such a great example of this. The first problem is that he merges things sort of conveniently at whatever given moment that he needs to. So he was asked about the Sermon on the Mount. Would you rather have a candidate who represented the values of the Sermon on the Mount? And then he replied, heck no, I'd run from that person as fast as I could, which is shocking, right? The idea that he's saying, if you see somebody who's like Jesus, run, is what he was saying. And then he morphs it into talking about what the United States does in how it deals with perhaps another country, like as a government. So what he's doing is excusing Trump's behavior, despite no matter how far away it is from being Christ-like, and then saying that the reason is because the government isn't a person. But we were talking about the man, And from what I have seen of him so far, it seems as though what he's really saying is, if you're going to have a government that functions somewhat amorally as it relates to other countries, since it's an entity and not a person, you need a person who somehow represents that same type of amorality, which I would think would be an odd thing coming from a pastor's mouth, that the best thing we could have is an amoral president.
Where do you stand on some of these? You hear there's people who critique Trump, obviously, on the right, people like David French and others, right, for his character, sort of what he's doing to the office, his tweets and so forth. And you have other people in Capitol Hill, like people like Ben Sass and others who are sort of casting these aspersions on Trump for his character issues. But most of them line up pretty closely to Trump in terms of policy. How do you parse that out?
Well, the first thing is that I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with the idea or the concept of a transactional relationship with a president. I think the way a transaction would work would be you have expectations of the person to fulfill your objectives and not make it difficult for you to support them, and in return they get your support. That's not what happens with Trump, though. The reason that it's not transactional, even though he does do things that people would like,
and some things which you agree with.
Oh, certainly.
Supreme Court nominees.
Supreme Court nominees.
Forth.
Absolutely. The issue is he's not actually giving anything in return. He's not making it easy for anybody to support him. And in fact, because he's so prone to throwing people under the bus if they speak ill of him, he's almost mafia-like in the way he treats the friends of the family, it puts people in a position where they either become a critic and therefore an enemy, or they pretend everything he does is great. And so a lot of people, in wanting to keep this transactional relationship alive, and I'm talking way beyond evangelicals, just everybody on the right, what ends up happening is they're more concerned about getting their policy objectives So they end up living a lot of times a lie. Yeah. And, knowing as many people as I do that work in this industry, because I've been in this industry for as long as I have, I hate even calling it an industry. Privately, they have angst about this, about how difficult he makes it for them. Yeah. And I'm always suggesting to them, it doesn't have to be difficult. Right. You can say that he shouldn't do this.
So this would be an example of this would be, say, Franklin Graham, who's quiet about Trump separating families at the border, because if he were to speak out strongly against that, he loses the larger, the larger issue. So he loses his prophetic voice in some ways. In some ways, the church suffers as a result as well.
And I'm not a psychologist, so I don't want to get too deep into this, but I will say that so much of it is frighteningly similar to how narcissists operate. Yeah. Because if you notice, using the example you gave about separating children at the border, Russell Moore, who has been a critic of Trump, he did say something about that. Yeah. And Trump, having gotten criticisms from Russell Moore, who was he headed the Baptist convention. Yeah. He already called out Russell Moore. He's already said that he's dead to the Republican movement and to evangelicals. So he's a bad guy. So what does Jerry Falwell Jr. do? He jumps up to snipe at him, just like the son who wants the narcissist dad's attention. Right. It's really
and Russell Moore almost lost his job over that too. Right. I mean, so the last issue in your New Good News, which to me is the most interesting one. The New Good News is associated with the lesser of two evils. Yes. What do you mean by that?
Well, this is to me the broadest one, and one that I would say I've even struggled with, and it's easy to struggle with, and I have a lot of empathy for how difficult it can be. Lesser evils essentially means you've got two options. They're the only two options you've got. One is bad, one is worse. If you're going to be rational about it, you choose bad over worse.
So be specific. 2016.
2016, Hillary Clinton is pro-choice, will appoint judges you don't like. She will not protect religious liberty. She will raise taxes. She will do all the things that you don't want as a Christian or a conservative. Trump, he brings all of this baggage and all of these problems with him, but he'll do things you like. This is bad, but this is worse.
Yeah. And how do you, what is your critique of that? Because you hear this all the time. Sure. I've heard this all the time, right? Lesser of two evils. I can't vote for Hillary. And then the big thing is, right, if you vote for neither, you're throwing your vote away, right? I mean, how do you answer that?
Well,
that critique, especially from when evangelicals bring it to you.
Well,
right?
It's very important that a lot of times it's very important that I am talking to somebody of some sort of faith.
Right.
Because I will say that if there was no greater moral truth in our universe, if truth was just something we all agreed on, as opposed to something that really fuels life, which I believe it is, pragmatically, sure. Yeah. Like, why wouldn't you do that? The entire idea of faith is you're answering to something higher than that. Right. And so once I establish that with the person, is there something higher to answer to? Yeah. It starts to become a question of, like, how much do you really trust God if you think that God is limited to the two-party system? That's a small God you're describing. He can't fulfill his will on earth unless you vote for the Republican. Yeah. I think the lesser evil argument is tempting but dangerous. I think it contributes to keeping a system in place that takes accountability out of the system. And I think it also is an easy way to bring in something like evangelicalism or any other faith and then use that as a way to get votes, which seems like about the worst possible way you could use faith.
To watch the rest of this program and other episodes of Afterwards, visit our website at booktv.org. Click on the Afterwards tab at the top of the page.